Welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. As always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
I am very, very good and very excited about today's episode.
I have to admit I'm exactly the same. Today our guest is Julianna Raye. Julianna is the CEO of Unified Mindfulness, a hugely experienced meditation teacher, and an accomplished researcher into the relationship between mindfulness and workplace stress and performance. Julianna, thanks for coming on.
Thanks. I'm feeling a little silly this morning, so I'm excited to dive into this very serious stuff.
Well, I want to dive straight in. You wrote something which I'll read more or less verbatim here. You wrote that you moved to LA and, quote, got signed to a record label as a singer, but had to confess that even while at Warner Bros., doing what I felt was my life's purpose, I was also miserable. I realized that wherever I went and whatever I did, I could not escape the mind experiencing it all. If my mind was not happy, life would only ever be a reflection of my unhappy mind. Is that for you the direct appeal of meditation?
Without a doubt. Yeah, until I discovered meditation, and I mean really dug in, I was looking at a future that was about trying to crawl out of a pit again and again. And I didn't actually know that I had the potential to transform my inner experience until I discovered meditation. So,
when you say crawling out of a pit, was that a experiential mental pit?
Absolutely. Yep. It was a chronic, regular process. It was such a part of my routine that I thought that's what life was.
I want to find out a little bit more. Is that in terms of the anxiety of being a singer and wanting to get signed and moving to a new city? Or was it something else?
No, for me, it wasn't just about circumstances. For me, it was a chronic way of perceiving, a chronic way of interpreting the information I was perceiving. Both of those, actually, because there's the perception side of it, which is sort of literally your sensory system. And then there's also the information you're getting and how your habitual ways that you interpret that information. And those two interact in ways that can be really devastating, actually.
It's very interesting that it's not just the content of your life that makes the difference of whether you're happy or unhappy, and maybe the content can be either here or there. But you're talking about a meta layer here, aren't you? The way of interpreting the kinds of things that happen in life. And that's not just going to get better by getting better content. Of course, a certain amount of good content, of course, is important for us to be well. But you're talking about the ability to interpret content, which is a sort of layer up, isn't it?
It is, and I'm saying additionally that when your ability to interpret content is faulty, and to whatever degree it is, that actually reinforces sensory discomforts, sensory suffering. So our perceptual system can be radically transformed through this practice, and that then has an effect on how we interpret our information, and how we interpret our information has an effect on our sensory system, so it sets up a virtuous cycle.
So that sounds like a fundamentally different problem to the content of my life wasn't good enough. You're saying the very lens through which I was viewing my life was stopping me from experiencing it in the way I want to. Is that how you diagnose the majority of suffering and unhappiness?
Me personally, and of course I can only speak to my own experience, but based on my experience, I say yes.
I mean, it's worth noting that, especially in the Western world, we've never had more resources, wealth, and comforts. It's just small things. You know, we have antibiotics. The majority of us have housing. Supermarkets exist. And if you were to try and weigh up our situations evolutionarily, you would come to the conclusion that things are brilliant, but you see increasing levels of anxiety, depression, and mental health issues. So I think there's definitely something to be said for it being the lens itself that's in need of changing. How did you get started with the Unified Mindfulness approach?
So I began meditating on my own at the advice of a therapist, and I was kind of it was fine. It was a couple of years that I did, and actually it was helpful, and it set a foundation of the habit, which was really important. But I wouldn't say that I was having any major breakthroughs. I was still really struggling. And though I began to have some interesting experiences a couple of years in, and that told me I probably needed a teacher, something a little more official, but I was extremely skeptical. I did not want to find the wrong teacher, someone that would put me off the whole endeavor. So I found my way to Shinzen Yang. He was recommended, a friend's father recommended him, and I went on my first retreat with him, and that's when I saw the true potential of this practice.
Yeah, I'm interested in the distinction because it seems like there's two types of meditation. There's the headspace, I started meditating and things got better experientially. I felt less anxiety, for example. But then there's the slightly more spooky experiences on the mat and the, oh wow, this practice has more than just making me feel better. Do you think of it in those terms, the two types of intensities?
I don't actually think of it in those terms. The way I think of it is that we're developing a set of attention skills, and that depending on the depth of those attention skills, so we can think about developing those skills as a kind of a linear progression. But another way to think about developing those skills is that we are revealing what's going on at deeper levels of our experience that we're not aware of. And so sometimes what can happen, unlike, you wouldn't go to a gym and expect to go from being able to lift whatever, 100 pounds to suddenly being able to lift 200 pounds, right? You wouldn't expect to have that kind of shift overnight. But with meditation practice, you can sit down and drop into heightened skill state without having made much effort towards it at all. Some people drop into it. These are natural skills. They're naturally occurring in our life. What meditation does is it says you can hone these specific attention skills and that base level will go up. But that doesn't change the fact that you can just drop into a deeper state for whatever reason. Nature can just that window can open up. So I think of it in terms of, in a moment like that, when something out of the ordinary happens, we can say that you've dropped into a deeper level of experience, and there are things you can do to make sure that that doesn't become a problem for you, that it becomes a way to develop your training.
It's interesting you say these are natural states. The example when I was learning to meditate that was often given is someone who surfs and really enjoys surfing will find themselves in a moment of attention with the activity. Are the types of states you're referring to a matter of attention ultimately?
That's a great question. Here's what I would say. We know that we have the ability to develop our attention in particular ways. And we know that as a result of developing our attention in particular ways, we see some reliable outcomes, such as lower stress and improved well-being. And that's about all I can say. I can't really speak to, the neuroscience of it. That would be Mark's territory.
Well, it's worth asking, Mark, when people have experiences on the mat or in daily life, like Julianna is referring to, is there a clear neuroscience, or rather, is that reflected clearly in the neuroscience? If you were to map my brain out in those moments, be it on the mat or the surfboard, would we see anything there that you wouldn't see in ordinary life?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult question. The brain is kind of alien tech, We like to make sounds like we've got a good grip on what the brain is all about and what it's doing. And it's true, our neuroscience methodologies are getting much better than they have been in the past. I mean, we're able to look at really sort of minute occurrences in the brain, but getting the framework right for understanding that data is still a moving target. I mean, we're in the middle of the science. We're definitely not at the beginning, but we're certainly not at the end. So we're getting some good data, and the different speakers that we're going to have on this podcast over the coming months are going to be able to speak to that even better than I am. So I would say it's challenging. It's challenging to know, but yeah, we see changes in the brain. We know some of the things are significant. For instance, people who have PTSD, they tend to have big amygdala complexes. The amygdala, one of the things it's going to be doing in the brain is highlighting when we're in danger or when there's uncertainty. And so it makes sense that if you come from an uncertain situation, you've been in a war, or you're hungry, or you have no shelter, then the part of the brain that tells you that that is sensitive to uncertainty should be bigger. It should have a bigger fingerprint in the brain. And we know that mindfulness of the body and mindfulness of anxiety helps to rebalance the way that the brain is operating when it comes to uncertainty, so that some of these systems start to go back to a more normal size and they get re-interconnected with other areas.
Yeah, Julianna, am I right in thinking you got your brain tested?
I have had my brain scanned, yes. I was part of a study in which they were comparing people of kind of the same age, and I'm left-handed, so they compared me to a left-handed person, and long-term meditators, and they definitely showed some changes in the brain. But again, it's sort of like blobology a little bit still. It's hard to know the specifics of what's going on in the brain. And I personally, I think one of the challenges as you're learning to meditate is this skepticism. I know it was for me. I was deeply doubtful about the whole thing. And fortunately, I was desperate enough that I overcame my doubt, because I sort of felt like I had nothing left to lose. But once you've had a taste of training and you know the impact of it, then you actually don't need you don't need that sort of validation from science, although it helps in many other ways. But in terms of, like, if I'm just speaking to someone interested in learning to meditate, one of the real hurdles we have to overcome is our skepticism, and science can be a good way to do that. But even better than science is your own direct experience from having put in some time and seeing the results for yourself.
Just a quick point there. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but they've done a study now that if you come up to give a talk and you put a brain on your first slide, then the audience is a certain percentage higher for just trusting anything you say. And it's a big percent. It's 30, 40, 50%.
Are you serious? I actually
you can just have a brain. Even if you say it, you can even sort of break the fourth wall there. You can say, here's a brain. Now I'm going to tell you some things. And we're tuned up, we're tuned up a little bit in our modern scientific age to sort of believe the neuroscientists.
That's
for better or for worse. For better or for worse. You're right. Experientiality is the way to go.
Yeah, I actually put my brain up when I give talks, so that's pretty hilarious. I had no idea.
I wonder if the effect is exaggerated when it's your brain.
I'm thinking, pretty impressive.
Yeah, I actually read that there was a paper that a neuroscience did on the effect of including the word neuroscience in your study. And it doesn't need to be causal neuroscience. You could be talking about neuroscience of birds running away from prey, and the audience is totally happy to go with you. As Mark said, it's something like a third or 40% more. So maybe there's a tip for anyone writing a paper in geography. I just wanted to jump into the unified mindfulness approach and find out how it's distinguished from other approaches that are out there.
Yeah, sure. Well, we like to say that we welcome all approaches. We like to say that we're kind of a universal key. And what we mean by that is basically, first of all, it's a kind of a classification system, if you will, for the major ways into this process we call meditating. In other words, worldwide, there have been these kind of innovations, these ways to explore this practice of meditation. And we like to create, give an overview. And we have a grid that sort of says, there are meditation styles that are like this, more like this, they're more like that. We have these quadrants that they fall into just generally. And anything, and then in addition to that, we have a set of 40 standard techniques that are grouped by those quadrants. So it's like simultaneously we're sort of saying like, hey, you want an overview of meditation practices worldwide? Here's our best shot at that. And then here's our standard set of techniques that, that we put into each of these quadrants.
One of the things I really appreciate about Unified Mindfulness, I'd just like to hear if I have it right and if you have anything to say here. We talk a lot about the science of meditation, so using scientific methodologies to see if we can learn anything extra or interesting about how those skills and techniques evolve, but also the sorts of states that we experience and the changes in consciousness that we have. But the Unified Mindfulness toolkit also feels like a kind of scientific approach to practice. So it's not just science of practice, but scientifically practicing. Does that sound right?
That's perfectly right. That's Shinzen Young's, he designed the system, and it was with that intent that he designed it. In other words, he wanted to take the scientific method to explore the field of meditative practices worldwide. And so that involved analyzing them into their parts, and based on that, organizing them in more intuitive ways, because when meditation practices emerge, they emerge kind of like wildflowers in different ways in different parts of the world. And you can then take an overview and parse out, systematize, group things according to, in more intuitive ways once you take that overview.
Okay, then at the risk of asking something terribly reductive, you have this quadrant of different approaches. Is there one that's more effective than another one, or are we saying that, well, it all depends on who you are and what you're most compatible with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's the question on every meditator's mind, right? Is there something I can be doing to optimize my experience? If I'm going to put my time and energy into this, I want to know that I'm not wasting my time and energy. And the answer is that the way we view it, what's most important is the development of a set of attention skills that we identify as concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity. And we basically say, mindfulness is these three abilities happening together, right? So when we frame it that way, when we say that the centerpiece is not what you're doing, but how you're doing it, in other words, how you're developing these attention skills, then you can see that what matters is your ability to develop the skills. And now we've got an adaptive model that we can now reconceive what are these technique instructions all about. They're really about helping you develop these skills. So anything that helps you develop these skills is what you should be doing. And that means that, for instance, you might find one technique works for you while you're seated on a cushion, and another technique works for you while you're walking around in daily life, and another technique works for you while you're in a meeting. We want you to think about this attention skill development as something you can do all day long, because the more you practice it, the better your outcomes are going to be. So the short answer is whatever gets you to practice is the best technique for you to be doing.
Yeah, this is an interesting moment, because when I hear that and I'm attracted to that kind of a model, that's kind of the tone a consultant might use with a business looking to make 25% more profit. And there's a perception around meditation that it's sort of, on the one level, exiting the game. But here it's like we're just planting a new good as the outcome, i.e. the development of these three skills, and then saying, guys, what works? What are the different methods? What's the quadrant? Is it that we're sort of playing the same game and the idea of progress not mattering is a little bit of a misnomer? Or are we actually playing a slightly different game?
Help me understand when you say the idea of the misnomer. I missed kind of what your intent was in that question.
Yeah, so I think if you ask non-meditators what they think of as the mindset of a meditator and their approach to their own meditation, they probably don't think of it in terms with the tone that you've just explained.
Progress, you mean?
Of progress, and this is a quadrant. It sounds like a consultant on one level saying, listen, this is how we're getting 25% more revenue this year. And I wanted to know how you think about that distinction, whether there is a distinction.
Yes, I see.
Yeah.
I think what you're pointing to is that this kind of debate that people have, is there a goal to meditating or not? Is that what you're pointing to?
Yeah, and because I mean I'm projecting terribly, but when I initially came to meditation at least, I thought, well, we're getting out of the game of progress in the traditional sense. But the way you framed it, it sounds like progress is still very much
Yes.
in
Yes.
kind of in the air.
Yes, I understand now. Yes. So there's this kind of fundamental um, debate that goes on in meditation traditionally, which can be kind of summarized as, do you put in effort or do you just discover original perfection, right? There was never any effort to do. It was always just there for you. Life was already perfect. You just were not aware of it. So, and the answer is yes and. Most people want to fall on one side of that debate. For instance, if you're big into Krishnamurti, well, that's going to show you, that's going to emphasize this don't do anything. You don't need to make any effort. Whereas if you ever do any like Rinzai Zen training, oh boy, are you going to be doing effort. So the question is, why do we have this debate? And the answer is because they're both true. And the problem is that people don't know how to reconcile the paradox of that. So, yeah, go ahead.
This is very much in my experience in my own practice. I like Ajahn Chah, Jack Kornfield's teacher, says, I only know a couple of teaching instructions. You know, he taught his whole life. And he says, I only know a couple of teaching instructions, a little left or a little right, right? Because you have all of these skills out to either ends of an extreme. And they are both true, and they are both good, and they're both wholesome at the right time and in the right context and for the right person. If you start off too soon and say it's effortless, then maybe you don't develop some of the techniques that you need for it to become effortless. But if you make it always about effort, maybe you effort a little bit too long. So that's really an art, isn't it? Being really sensitive to what another person needs, and then being willing not to do one thing, but to do lots of things and in a sort of context-dependent way.
It is, and yet I do tend to fall, let's put it this way. I think what often happens is that there's a merging and a conflating of a whole bunch of different points into this one general idea. Should I effort or should I not effort? Should I try to make progress or should I not try to make progress? And I think we need to disambiguate, because let's first understand that really what we're talking about is when you have deep insight, original perfection is revealed, okay? The ordinary mind doesn't have deep insight. Most of us don't have that. And are you gonna spend your life rolling the dice that one day nature will plunge you into the depth of wisdom, and that will shatter forevermore your understanding about separateness or non-separateness, right? So are you going to do that or not? And I think that we can say that there's no harm in meditating. And if you meditate, you are more likely to know the depth of experience. And so we can say that, yes, from a certain perspective, effortlessness is the aim, but that's because of a certain skill called equanimity that most people don't have well developed. Most people interfere in subtle ways with their sensory experience. And it is that interference that creates what we call ordinary experience. And we're saying, like, no, we have to systematically remove what interferes with that for most people. Not everybody, but most people need to actually, reverse the habits that have been set in motion over a long period of time. So, but when we talk about effortlessness, what we're talking about is experientially. What can happen when nature opens up and shows you the depth of concentration, clarity, equanimity, shows you what it's like for there to be non-interference in your sensory system. what you discover in those moments when there is non-interference in your sensory system is, lo and behold, it's all perfect. So that's what people often misunderstand, because they're coming from a position of separateness and saying, well, it's telling me there's effortlessness, so why should I make an effort? It's a point of confusion, common confusion.
You said a few times there, nature just opening the way, and then you have this transformative experience. John Chuladasa Yates used to say to me that meditation was like making yourself accident prone for those kinds of experiences. You're just upping the probability that you get to see something true.
Yeah, exactly so.
Yeah, Julianna, you've spoken in the past about the slightly strange relationship between mindfulness as a practice and diagnosable conditions like depression. Because while mindfulness can clearly help, that doesn't make a mindfulness teacher qualified to treat depression. And it just makes them qualified to help somebody develop a practice that can in turn reduce those symptoms. So how do you untangle that? And what's the role of meditation in helping someone with, say, an underlying but manageable condition like depression?
Oh, I think you articulated it perfectly. That's the role. The role is knowing your boundaries as a mindfulness trainer, knowing your area of expertise and sticking to that, and knowing when it's time maybe to encourage supplements, or even, if you're taking on a client, for instance, knowing that they have what we call supplements in place. In other words, psychotherapy, if they need psychotherapy, medication, if they need medication. So we don't make any assumptions about mindfulness being a cure-all for anyone, for any individual. And we look at it as a complementary practice. And for some people, it can even become the centerpiece practice. For me, certainly that's the case. It's a centerpiece. But people need different things, and they need them in different degrees, So it's again, if we take an adaptable, if we look at an adaptable approach to something like depression, with regards to your meditation practice, your mindfulness practice, you have to cut your own path. And we're not in the business of being prescriptive about this practice. In other words, we're here to support the development of these attention skills because we know that it can have profound outcomes for you. But there are other parts of the puzzle that only you can have a clear picture about, additional support that you may need. And so we can only do what we can do. One of the reasons that, I love the Unified Mindfulness approach is that, for instance, it hardwired into it, it takes into account things such as people's window of tolerance. So, for instance, people can sometimes make assumptions when they start digging into meditation that if discomforts come up, I should really bear down. I should really kind of auger into it, get into it, and untangle it. And a drivenness can form around, I got to get to the bottom of this so that I can become free of it, right? That's a kind of a common mindset that people fall into as they're doing a lot of meditation practice. And that's a legitimate strategy to say, I need to work with this experience. I need to go deep into it, and I need to work through it. But an equally valid strategy is what we call anchoring away, which is where you are still applying your skills, but not directly to the source of the pain, such as emotional pain. So in that case, you could do an open-eyed practice. You could be looking at the world around you. You could be developing the very skills that will help you with that emotional pain, but you're not turning it toward the pain. You're not bearing down on that. So hardwired into this method is the ability for you to know what your window of tolerance is around your own suffering, your own personal suffering, and to have clear strategies that will be effective, and that don't require you to do something that's going to push you too much. So it's important to understand, again, if we have this skill development model, it's the development of those skills that can really help with your symptoms of depression.
We had some research come out last year, actually, that backs it up in a big way. And it was something that, I've been meditating for a long time, and I'm also a meditation teacher. But it was something that I really needed to be reminded of and foregrounded, which is if you have an obsessive personality, sitting with your eyes closed where you can't fight or flight, and then looking at the hardest possible bit of data in your experience is not going to be valuable for you, because you're already the kind of person who runs on a thing. And so for people who are obsessive, like you say, anchoring away turns out to be a really valuable strategy to learn how to use. But people who are avoidant in their personalities, their avoidance is keeping the pathology in play. And so they have to learn to orient towards. So there again, it's context dependent. It's not so easy as to say, look at the problem or avoid the problem. Rather, you need to be, this is why it was so valuable for me to have people in my life that I trusted who understand meditation also in their lives, that I can occasionally check in with to see, should I be turning towards or away, because it is so context dependent.
Absolutely. And I'll say one more thing, which is that as you dive into that's why, going back to your original question about sort of, is there one right technique? When you base it on your own interests and what feels manageable to you, then you can develop a momentum with the skills, concentration, clarity, equanimity. The baseline starts to elevate. And as you develop the momentum with the skills, you actually become more resilient. And then if you're someone who is avoidant, that resilience helps you turn toward as you need to.
Yeah, there's so much in there. One question I have for you both is, if on the one hand we're saying that meditation and development of those three skills in particular can help improve your experience in several significant ways, how do you hold that in the one hand and then in the other not suggest it basically all the time for everyone in some capacity? Because, like if going for a jog, if jogging consistently helped you have permanent insights into the reality of nature in a way that improved your experience, and I knew that about jogging, I would struggle to not talk to people on park benches and say, listen, these are your shoes, don't worry about it, I'll meet you back here in 5K. How do you, I'm Mark, starting with you, how do you hold both in there at the same time?
Yeah, well, actually, I think part of the answer is what we've already been discussing, which is it's so context sensitive. The skills and abilities that what we call meditation, which really is just an umbrella term for lots of skills and ability development programs, a lot of them are valuable, but they're not always going to be valuable. And again, the ingredient mix for each person is going to be different. So I don't think, there are definitely going to be some aspects of the meditative toolbox that are not going to be beneficial for every person at every time. So personally, I take a sort of holistic approach to mental well-being, where the meditative toolbox is one of the big toolboxes, but I don't think it's the only toolbox to be considering, especially when there's critical issues. A lot of people in the communities that I'm a part of are dual wielding right now different kinds of therapy with their mindfulness training toolbox, and that seems to be a really good mix. They're able to bring some of their tools for insight to their therapy sessions to be able to speak more clearly and to better regulate their emotions, and then they're able to take the things that they discover in a therapist's room back onto the cushion, which seems valuable.
Yeah, Julianna, does that sort of strike home?
I take a pragmatic approach. I have sort of a different angle on it, I guess. To me, I think what I heard you say is, we know this can have a profoundly positive effect. Why wouldn't you sort of lead with the profoundly positive effect it can have? Is that kind of what you're saying, or just make sure I've understood?
95%. I guess my question is just the additional piece is, unlike jogging, the claims around meditation and the effects of meditation are significant in as far as they give you insight into the nature of being a human experience. And
so why not lead with that?
Well, not in terms of the advertising of it, but it seems like a distinct claim from the claims other things that improve our mental well-being are making. And that distinction in terms of basically how brilliant it can be in improving your life, how do you find how do you hold that truth in the one hand and find yourself not preaching all the time at everybody in the other?
Yes. Yeah, now I understand. Thanks for clarifying that. I think that it's really important to, excuse me, I think that it's really important to meet people where they live and to meet people in what matters to them. Because really it's not for me to say what matters to them. And that's why we tend to look at it as, well, what are the areas of life that you're interested in improving? And we have this thing, another grid, because Shinzen loves to organize things, called the happiness grid, which basically tends to be that we can group people's happiness goals, that what they're looking to get out of life, into these 5 basic categories, which are relief, fulfillment, insight, mastery, and service. These are our sort of general, kind of intuitive groupings. And what we like to do is say, okay, let's think about these areas in terms of where you might like to either enhance what's already going on for you or to address some kind of challenge that you're having. And that's where we start with the practice. We say, we know that generally speaking, this practice can help you. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it can help you with the things that matter to you. So let's start with the things that matter to you and introduce it in that context. And then from there, if your interest develops, great, your interest develops. But if your interest doesn't develop, at least we've helped you achieve a goal that's meaningful for you.
Right, exactly. And speaking of meaningful goals, you were involved in the publication of a number of studies on the effect of mindfulness on workplace stress. How was all of that?
Yeah, so we actually published 3 articles from a study that we did at Fathom Digital Marketing. It's a digital marketing company. And we got a lot of really useful information out of that study. One of the most recent article talks about the value of practice in daily life, which is something that goes back to what I said earlier about dosage, that what you really want is to develop these skills as much as possible, because you want that overall base level to go up. And when that goes up, you start getting those outcomes. So what I did in that workplace environment was to make sure that not only were they doing this, daily seated practice, but that they had a very clear framework. That's another reason I love Unified Mindfulness. When you take a scientific approach to the practice, you can develop frameworks that are really helpful for people to lean on. So we have these very clear frameworks around how to integrate practice into your daily life. We don't just sort of tell you to do it. We say, here's some strategy suggestions. Here's how you can in any setting. And then we had people actually implement that. And then we checked, had them Qualtrics. We had them sign in and say, I did it at these times of day. One really popular time of day was in the shower. Another was while you're driving, right? So anyway, we had that very interesting outcome that if they're practicing mindfulness in daily life, that's going to increase their outcomes. Not a big surprise, but it hasn't ever really been tested before. Why? I think because there hasn't been such a clear framework for introducing mindfulness into the daily life. Yes, I see Mark. Sorry.
No, I was wondering, I've always wanted to ask this from somebody, and I think you might be a good person to ask it of. What prevents teaching mindfulness for workplace stress from just making people complacent relative to certain things that need to change in the workplace? So you're teaching people to better manage their anxieties, but maybe their anxieties are rooted in real systemic issues that the company should address, rather than just making the employees better able to be equanimous with those conditions. You could imagine a kind of, some businesses really push their people and then they implement a mindfulness training program just so that they can take more of the pressure rather than releasing the pressure. So I wonder just if maybe it's the approach to mindfulness that can sort of assuage that worry, or what do you think?
That's a great question. I mean, honestly, I think the approach has to be holistic. If you care about your workers, you have to care about them all dimensions. You can't just selectively say, let's turn this into a training ground for your meditation skills and see you later on the back end. I mean, tragically, I think that can happen, but I think also it depends on the quality of the mindfulness training they receive. Because there is a lot of training out there calling itself mindfulness training that actually isn't going to give you the kinds of inner results that you're hoping for. So there's that dimension too, where sort of like, yeah, we'll give them what we're calling mindfulness training. I mean, I remember witnessing at a retirement community what they called meditation training, and they just stuck people in a room with waves on a screen, and that's what they called meditation. So, number one, so these are kind of indicators, right? If your workplace mindfulness program is lame, well, I think you know something about the workplace and the intentions at the top of the chain. If you have a robust workplace mindfulness program, that's also an indication of their intention. But if they don't address the whole of the problem, in other words, if there is a problem that people are overworked, then the mindfulness is only going to take you so far. And if a workplace is stuck on only giving mindfulness training and not addressing the concerns of its employees, as an employee, if possible, you might want to figure out an exit. But meanwhile, if you're given good mindfulness training, that can help you in your job search.
And maybe also to be sensitive about your own window of tolerance, right?
That's right.
Because maybe you're not aware that you're outside of your window of tolerance so much, and it becomes evident through a good mindfulness training program.
Yes, good quality mindfulness training is going to help you, including it might help you say, you know what, I need to be working somewhere else.
Yeah, so in summary, if you're a bad employer, giving people mindfulness training is less likely to allow you to keep getting away with it, but more likely to lead to more clarity around your misdoings.
Exactly so. Yes.
I want to change the pace just slightly and talk to you about practical advice. So, in the context of the workplace, but also people in undergraduate, graduate school, etc., it's stressful. There's COVID, people are struggling for work, all of the obvious. What would you recommend someone who hasn't got a meditation practice per se, but is interested in improving their well-being, whatever that kind of means? What would you recommend they practically go and do?
I'd say break your ideas of what meditation is, first of all, for instance, if you're resistant to it because you don't want to sit still, actually, you don't have to sit still. If you understand it as skill development, develop the skills. So what are the skills? Concentration power is the ability to focus on what you choose. Sensory clarity is the ability to track your experience in real time as it's happening. And equanimity is the ability to allow your experience to come and go freely. And what that means, that equanimity thing, it means that you're dropping your resistance to your sensory experience as it's happening. So in other words, without realizing it, we tense up around our experience. Even just like as I talk to you, maybe my shoulders go up a little bit and I need to remember to relax my shoulders. When you relax your shoulders, that actually is one way that you can induce equanimity. Why? Because you're releasing the stored tension in the muscles, and anytime you can release the stored tension in any part of your sensory system, you can help along this skill that we're calling equanimity. So I would say just learn about the skills and then start to understand how you can be practicing them throughout your day. during exercise is a great time to know how to practice developing concentration, clarity, equanimity, because then you're kind of, you're able to do the exercise. It's doing double duty for you. And I basically, my short answer is work smart. Develop the skills and work smart. If you're not someone who wants to sit on a cushion, figure out how to do it off the cushion.
And stripping it back to bare basics, does that effectively mean either sitting down on the chair or on the floor, depending on how I'm feeling and what my capacity is, closing my eyes and focusing on the breath?
No. As I've just said, it means concentration, clarity, and equanimity. So you don't have to be sitting on the floor, closing your eyes at this point. Now, down the line, if you can get enough momentum and you start to notice that you're having positive outcomes, you might want to do that. But if you're somebody who has no patience for that, first start by learning about those skills and understanding how you can bring them into different experiences. For instance, eating or washing your dishes or doing activities, walking the dog. There are all sorts of activities that you do with regularity, brushing your teeth, that can serve at double duty for developing these skills, these attention skills. And if you can insert them, piggyback them onto your pre-existing habits, then you build that habit of the attention skill development, and then you start to notice outcomes from that, and then maybe you build up more of an interest in it and you go from there. So I would say your main goal is habit building around this skill development, and to try to pair it with something you already do so that it's easy to weave into your life.
Yeah, I love that. And Mark, are there any tips for building that momentum in your approach to meditation?
No, I think everything Julianna just said is fantastic. Start small. Start where you are. Start with the things that you're already interested in. I love that part of our chat today about starting where you are wanting to be happy. And I love this double duty point that Julianna's used. It's exactly right, because being present, paying close attention, and learning to be a little bit less judgmental, those are meta qualities. They don't have anything to do with the content, regardless of the content. Brushing your teeth or eating a meal or walking outside or wherever you are, starting to develop some of those abilities. And I agree, once they start to have some traction, then maybe there is a place to evolve the practice in a more formal way, because you're going to want to take those potentially past what your everyday experience allows you opportunities for.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there actually and highlight, you mentioned learning how to be non-judgmental. And I think can often be a confusion around that, which is sort of like, but I have to have preferences. That's part of life. And what I want to highlight is actually it's a practice because why? Because it develops what we're calling equanimity. If you practice non-judgment, in other words, suspending your opinion about whether what you're experiencing is good or bad. Not suspending your opinion, by the way, about whether what's happening in the world is good or bad. Suspending your opinion about what is happening internally in your sensory system is good or bad. That is one strategy for developing this skill, equanimity. Why? Because it reduces friction in your sensory system. And that's the aim. The aim with equanimity is we want to keep lowering the friction in the sensory system. And non-judgment is one way to do that. Another way to do that, I just mentioned, is relaxing the shoulders. So that may sound like those are two completely different things, but they are two different strategies for developing that same core skill of equanimity.
Yeah, and there's something quite provocative in the very first instance about the idea we started with, which is I was miserable not because of what was going on in my life, but somehow the lens through which I was seeing it was leading to me to have bad outcomes experientially. And it's really interesting to hear how you can develop the skills to effectively change that lens, which is, I guess, what we're talking about.
Exactly so. Yeah, I had no idea. I remember, sitting miserably in my car, waiting for my waitressing shift to start and thinking to myself, just feeling at a loss and thinking, I don't know how I'm ever going to get out of this. But what I know is it's in here. It's in my mind. It's not anywhere else. And that was a moment of clarity. It suddenly dawned on me that there was no escape through any means other than to go through a transformation internally. And I did not know how to make that transformation happen. And I would not have predicted ever, if you had said to me meditation would become so central to my life, I would have laughed you out of the room. I never, ever, even when I started doing it, even those first 2 years, until I went on a retreat and discovered what it really means to get momentum with concentration, sensory clarity, equanimity. You could not have convinced me that meditation was going to have the impact on my life that it's had. So it's a lot of, my motivation for training people is I want them to get that first taste so they know what's possible. Because once you've had that first clear taste, then it's just a matter of, I see. Okay, I can do this internally. And I just have to keep it up. And I can manage that.
Julianna, where can everybody find you listening to the podcast?
Unified Mindfulness, so unifiedmindfulness.com. And we have a free 11 video series, unifiedmindfulness.com/core, CORE is our core training. It's a free video series. We also have an accompanying free book that goes with that on Amazon. You can download that if you're more of a reader. And we like to make it available to everyone who's interested so that at the very least you can get started with a practice that's going to be helpful to you and gives you a little more clarity on, or even a lot more clarity on what these skills are that we're talking about. Concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity.
Mark, anything to add?
No, that's fantastic. I have some experience with the Unified Mindfulness methodology, and I have lots of good friends who have gone the distance in the teachers' trainings there, and it is a really high-quality training program, and I completely recommend it for anybody who's interested in learning more about how to meditate.
Julianna, thank you for coming on to the Contemplative Science Podcast.
Yeah, thanks
Jamie,
so much.
Mark, oh my goodness, this was really wonderful. Thank you so much.